So our last performance, I think, was in the Blue Mountains, and it was during the fires there.
Whoa.
And we were surprised at how many people came. And some of the conversations afterwards were, "Oh, we don't know if we're going to go back to our house tonight, but we're glad we came here," which was a bit terrifying, but we're very thankful for everyone who came down, which was a bit of fun.
It is great to have today's guest back on the podcast. He was on about 3 years ago talking about what he was up to, and he's done so many cool projects since then. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are chatting with Australian bassist Elsen Price, who, prior to the pandemic, was on a tour in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and the UK. He recorded a solo album called Descent of the Free, and we're going to hear a little bit of that today. So many other projects that we dig into. It was really great to connect with him, and I hope we get a chance to do so in person one of these days after all of this is over. Quick shout out to the folks that have sponsored the podcast over the months and years. If you would like to help the bass community recover, any purchase from these companies would be greatly appreciated by them, and you'd be doing the bass world a solid. So thank you to A440 Violin Shop, Modacity, Kolstein Music, D'Addario Strings, Upton Bass, The Bass Violin Shop, and Steve Swan String Bass. Okay, here we go with our conversation with Elsen Price. I live in San Francisco, and we've been at home for, I think it's 3 weeks or maybe more than that at this point. So we're all getting a little stir crazy here. But are you in Sydney proper? Are you in the actual city of Sydney, or?
I'm within 1 kilometre of the airport, so pretty close to where the centre is. Yeah.
Are you in that? There's that awesome neighborhood with all these breweries. That's Marrickville or something like that.
Marrickville, yeah, it's sort of within throwing distance of that. Yeah.
Okay. I've got a friend named Matthew Tucker who's got Bresk basses in Marrickville. I don't know if you ever visited that shop or.
A few times, yeah.
Okay. So I was just there in like mid-November, somewhere around the mid to late November, mostly Melbourne, for this bass event that Rob Nairn was putting on. But I came to Sydney for a few days and hung out with Matthew and a few other people, saw a concert at the Opera House, and it was, you all have had quite a year, because when I was there, it was just like the second day I was in Sydney, it was getting really smoky, but it was nothing. I mean, I think the worst was yet to come for the fires and everything, but what a crazy year it must have been for folks in Australia, because, that it looks from our side like it ended, or it settled down. But now, of course, there's this. So, man, tough year to be anywhere.
Yeah, the bushfires were quite bad. It was, the closest we got was in the Blue Mountains, which is about an hour and a half from Sydney, and we were getting ash on our balcony in our apartment. So it's travel's pretty far. It's quite a big deal. Yeah, I'm sort of glad that that's all over. But now this is.
I know.
It keeps getting better.
I know. That's exactly. But I can't wait to come back after this is all over and explore a little. It was like far, I think I took 11 days or maybe something like that. But it's 17 hours from here to Sydney and back. So it's I need to get out and explore more. But you went on quite a tour, it looks like. Was that 2019 into just now? Around the country?
Last year, did a tour of a solo album I released last year on ABC and Universal Music, which was a bit of fun. I did a performance in Sydney, Melbourne, Hobart, Perth. I went over to New Zealand, to Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, then did a little show in Tokyo, then went and performed over in the UK. So it was it was a fun little trip.
Do you bring your own bass? I'm assuming you bring your own bass for that, or were you borrowing basses?
I'm okay to fly to New Zealand. It's essentially a domestic flight, but flying internationally with the instrument, I think, is always a bit of a gamble.
Yeah.
So I borrowed instruments over in the UK,
Okay.
and borrowed instrument over in Japan as well.
Okay.
So I was quite lucky for all that.
Yeah, I try to never bring my bass unless I absolutely have to, but I know like I'm also not playing solo in the way that you are, so I know that having your own instrument is pretty important. Do you have a removable neck or anything? You just sort of let it rock in a bass case, or what do you do when you're bringing it domestically?
Yeah, I've had a few thoughts of sort of getting a travel instrument, but I have committed to taking the full instrument. Yeah. I mean, I haven't sort of gone down that road yet, but it might. Depends on how things work out. But so you have a travel base, do you?
No, I don't. I just borrow when I go out of town, but I'm usually like playing in an ensemble or playing something more like educational. I'm not up on stage playing an hour-long solo performance or something like that. If I was, I might think about bringing my bass or bringing a travel bass. But I'm just always curious what people do. For your tour, was it just you? Was it just solo bass, or were you collaborating with other people along the way? What were you doing on the tour?
It started off as a solo tour because it's based with loop pedal, and it's sort of been an evolving process since about 2012. So this solo with loops and that sort of thing. In Sydney, I did a double bill with, or triple bill with Kolstein, a wonderful viola player from Miami, and also a percussion electronics musician called Eishan, who does some interesting things. Down in Melbourne, I did a double bill with Emma Sullivan, the principal bass player for the Melbourne Chamber Orchestra, which is sort of contrast styles. Down in Hobart, did a full 3-hour performance at Mona. Did you have a chance to go down to Mona at all while you're in Melbourne?
No, I didn't. I next time.
It's a wonderful initiative by the owner there. It's essentially an incredibly large, very open art space that caters for everything, and so much so that I was allowed to do a 3-hour non-stop improvised performance.
Wow.
But did a double bill with Tim Newhouse over in Perth. But as far as actual playing with others, because sort of by that point I sort of thought about doing some collaborative work with the album, because it sort of has a lot of those options in it. It's improvised music, but it has very sort of strong concepts, and I think by that time I was sort of ready for someone else's input to the music. And I did do another performance in Australia at the Blue Mountains with Dr. John Napier, so one of the head teachers at University of New South Wales. And that's where I opened it up into duet, as opposed to, and that's where I didn't actually use a loop, and I played with sort of improvised cello and improvised double bass, just a bit of fun. But over in New Zealand, I did actually set up a sort of an ensemble with the music. In Auckland, I performed with Chris O'Connor, Ron Samson, and the bass player Eamon Edmondson-Wells. So it was 2 drums and 2 basses playing this album, which was sort of just in my imagination beforehand. And then when we actually turned up and played it, it sort of worked out that we actually didn't have a rehearsal. We sort of jumped on stage and did the performance, and that turned out really well. I was really surprised at how that turned out. Then down in Wellington, played with Mark Lockett, Chris Bienick, another wonderful young bass player, and also Noel Clayton, a wonderful rising guitarist, and that sort of opened up another direction. But down in Christchurch, I just did a solo performance down there. Then when I went to Tokyo, I wasn't aware of the different sort of power that you have for your various electronic gears. So I actually did a performance without loop pedal, which when you're doing an hour-long improvised performance, and I mean, it's very interesting, but it's very, very taxing when you sort of get rid of the loop element of that, and you're sort of doing that. But that was good. That was a good bit of fun. Then over in the UK, I just did straight solo performances of it without the loop pedal, just to open up a bit. So I did. Yeah, I think that's the wonderful part of improvised music is you can open it up in different directions. So there was quite a number of different, I guess, interpretations of the music. So yeah, ended up being quite fun for the long run.
It's interesting. Yeah, that's so crazy with the impedance difference you get sometimes in countries. A friend of mine, Andres Martin, is a bass player, lives in Mexico. He was performing with pedals, or planning on performing in Italy, and I don't know what it was. Like like he had the right power converters, or whatever. There was something with the impedance. It didn't work. It was making all these noises that it wasn't supposed to, and so he had to ditch the piece at the end. But it's great that you were able to play solo. But I can imagine. Yeah, having that multi-layer ability with looping, I'm sure that's still taxing, but it must be really different than like being totally by yourself without that ability. And it's interesting. I dig the new album, and I can see how those tracks would lend themselves to being turned into small ensemble pieces. With some of the percussive things or the drones. How did you record the album? Were you just overdubbing, or were you looping in the studio, or what were you doing in terms of the actual recording of the album?
I recorded the whole album in 6 hours, which I was very, very happy with. It was with a friend of mine, George Sheridan, a bass player and also R&B musician in Sydney, who works a lot with electronic artists and R&B artists and that sort of thing. And it worked out really, really well to have someone so used to the concept of loops and, sort of inauthentic sort of electronic sounds. So we're treating the bass like a big electronic music, and we're recording it, and we're doing all these different things with it. And so much that the recording process was very, very quick. So for a lot of the solo pieces, they didn't take very long to record, but the long pieces, so I think it's track 4, there's about 10 levels of double bass, 10 layers of double bass. And sort of if you look at the time length of that, so that track I think is about 10 or 15 minutes long or something. When you sort of times that by 10, you're looking into 2 hours of recording time. So that was a very interesting process, because it's sort of very much, I think from a practical perspective, you need to make sure you can play for 6 hours regularly, consistently, which is very, very difficult. So I did all the tricky parts at the start of the recording, but all the easy parts at the end of it. But also just being very critical straight away, sort of not having someone in the box sort of giving you directions, but sort of directions yourself, going, okay, that was a good take, that wasn't so good, that was excellent. Just sort of half piecing it together. And I'm sort of glad that it was only done in 6 hours and not sort of done over a lengthy time. Because I think if you put it over a lengthy time, you sort of lose the spontaneity that you get with this sort of improvised music. Where there might be a few sort of ups and downs in the music, but it's still quite consistent. Still has the energy about it and that sort of thing. But yeah, it turned out quite well. And we recorded at I think it's now closed, the music feed studio in Eishan. That's actually near Matt Tapper's workshop as well.
So cool.
We're all very close.
That's I love that area. That's such a cool part of town.
Yeah, industrial and artsy and all that.
Yeah.
Sort of stuff. But yeah, it turned out quite well. I was sort of very surprised at how it turned out, because I think every time you invest in a recording, it's sort of a little bit like gambling, and you don't know what's going to turn out. But yeah, I was very happy with it, and it did suit the concept that I was going for at the start. So not much of that. I mean, none of it was written down, except I did come up with a chord progression for track 4. But other than that, a lot of it was very spontaneous, and yeah.
Well, I was curious about that. Okay, so you did for track 4, you did have sort of a general chord progression in mind, but most of that, you were just walking into the studio and what happened? Is it okay? I know, because I know solo improv and group improv is something that you do, so that's obviously like you're probably pretty comfortable in that world, but that's cool. Okay, I was curious if you had like kernels of ideas before you went in there, or if it really was, just kind of see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's very conceptual based music. So I think with the creepal aspect of that sort of thing is just making sure it suits the concept. Mm-hmm. Sort of not getting carried away of trying to do anything too clever, or sort of trying to push any specific idea over the thing. Just make sure it's sitting with the concept that you wanted to at the start, and hopefully it'll all sort of come together at the end.
Yeah. Yeah. What's the I don't know how exactly, we don't need to classify what you do. I don't know what genre you would put on it, but I'm always interested by the scenes in different cities or different countries. Like, what's the, like, and I was listening through all these other small ensemble projects you do. What's the creative music scene like in Sydney or maybe in Australia in general? Like, what's that, here in San Francisco, we have some great venues, but we have, we're a very expensive city. I know Sydney is too. I think Sydney's even more expensive. So that's put a lot of pressure on those venues here. We have a lot less of them than we used to. But like, just what's that scene like in general in terms of like venues and the artists and audiences and that kind of thing?
I've been a radio presenter, community radio presenter since 2016 or 2015 or so. And that's all new Australian music. So I've sort of found myself in an interesting position where I am getting sent quite a bit of new Australian music, which happens around the immediate area. It's interesting how everyone works here. Now, there are very strong sort of pockets of, scenes and whatnot. Like, there's a very strong sort of new music scene. There's a very strong new jazz scene. There's a strong traditional jazz scene. There's, I guess, an avant-garde scene. And it's all, most of it is very, very DIY, but then, of course, there are sort of other things that are a little bit more formal with that. I think in any city in the world, especially improvised music or, new music, it's very much the initiative of the artists themselves, plus maybe a few, philanthropists or investors and people like that who want to sort of put on bigger things. It's quite good, but the tricky part with Sydney is a few years ago, actually around the same time I started this radio show, was they brought in these bizarre rules about venues and lockout laws and alcohol sales and all this sort of stuff. It was a fairly nasty state government decision, which didn't really make any sense, but it ended up sort of being in favour of the government. They wanted on paper that they were fixing what was going on, but unfortunately, with the creative scene, it put a lot of pressure on venues and a lot of pressure on artists. And not in a very blunt way, but just sort of taking money out of the industry. So a lot of the venues that people would be playing at and would be a part of this broader network of venues were losing money because they couldn't operate after 2 a.m. and all this sort of trickle down sort of stuff ups with the system, which put a lot of people in various ways, sort of, both positive and negative with the whole thing. But one thing that I have noticed with the younger generation, so this has been something that's sort of gotten quite bad in the last 10 years or so. It's been a big change in the scene, but I guess like the, students who are studying, who are putting together the new ensembles, they're sort of bypassing that. They're sort of just getting a lot more savvy with putting together something creative, getting online with it, putting it out there, getting their network of friends involved and doing, as we all do when we start out, doing some underground performances, doing some backyard performances, getting a venue, getting a warehouse somewhere and putting on things, just sort of bypassing this, these issues that have been happening, which is fantastic. So, which is, I think it really shows the powerful initiative that artists put into their own music and what that does for the scene in general. Because if you come to Sydney and you say, I want to check out some cool, weird new music, you aren't going to find it. You're going to have to talk to a few different people and sort of get directed to different venues. Like, I did a live streaming performance last week for a venue called Johnson Street Jazz, and where we were performing wasn't necessarily where we should have been performing, but we did it anyway. But everyone was safe and all that sort of thing. But so those little initiatives carry the scene, unfortunately, here. If you look at somewhere like Melbourne, it's a completely different story. It's very creative. It's very open. There's a lot going on. People compare it to Berlin, which is fantastic.
I've heard that comparison with Melbourne too. It's interesting. Sydney sounds like a lot of what the avant-garde scene or the free jazz scene is doing here in the San Francisco Bay Area. There are a lot of places that on the books probably shouldn't be performing venues, but they're being, people are finding ways to make it happen. Wow. It's how did this radio show come about? That must be fascinating. What a cool way to sort of be connected with what's going on in the musical scene. How did that come to be?
It was a response to the laws, because I mean I've been a performing artist my whole sort of life type thing, and sort of when you find these issues, I think as a more mature musician, sort of past student, and so you're finding these same problems of either you're not getting airplay or you're not getting a performance, and the same sort of conversation. You're sort of wondering, why isn't this happening? Why aren't we putting on so many creative performances? Why isn't this happening? And I found one big issue was that Australian audiences just weren't connecting with Australian music, which is a bit unfortunate. So it's just sort of put two and two together and thought, okay, I'm just going to put on an only Australian music show. So then it's only Australian music, so people listening would only be listening to Australian music. And with that, I was also doing interviews with artists so they can talk about what they're doing, what they've got coming up, and so just people can actually hear what's going on as opposed to having to trawl through, Chinese whispers of what's going on. And yeah, no, it's been quite interesting. I've met a lot of very interesting people, and with the people involved, it's from, I guess, established classical composers to I've had professional buskers on the show. I've had avant-garde performers, but also singer-songwriters, people on major labels, people independently. It's a good mix, and when you find similar comparisons with the same issues, especially here in Sydney, if a major label artist has difficulty putting shows on in Sydney, and also an emerging artist is difficulty putting shows on in Sydney, then you realise there's a consistent problem there. It's not you're too small to know what you're doing. It's sort of but and everyone's got their own solution to it. So some people might create a bigger online presence, or people might just do more performances, or people might head overseas just to build their brand and all that sort of thing. And everyone's got their own little ways and means around it, which is fantastic. And I think when people want to get their music played on the radio and want to get on there and do an interview, you can obviously tell that they're very serious about what they're doing. And it's quite pleasant actually.
What a cool addition to your musical life, which already seems quite rich to me with what you do on the solo bass. And then I love the various ensembles that you work in all kinds of different styles, from what I'd think of a little more down the classical road to totally improvised. It's really interesting. And just one more, I spent a whopping 11 days in Australia, but it's so interesting to go to a country that's the size of the United States, in terms of land mass, but 25 million people, I think, right? Something like that. And in these large cities spread out over long distances, it's just such an interesting, such an interesting set of differences. I got off the plane in Sydney and I felt very at home because the Mediterranean landscape and everything. I spent 17 hours on a plane and I felt like I never left. But it's just really interesting, and how cool to feature or focus on music from Australia. It seems like there's a lot going on, and not just in Sydney or in Melbourne, but it was really interesting for me to meet people from Brisbane and Perth and just learn about what's going on. It was mostly the bass scene that I was learning about, and what a cool window into that radio show must give you. And I love some of these other. Can you I don't even know where to start, but I was listening to some of these different groups that you play in, and just tell me about some of these ensemble projects that you've been up to maybe the last couple of years.
I guess one that's been doing some interesting things is called the Eishan Ensemble.
Mm-hmm.
It's a wonderful group put together by an Iranian guitar player called Ahmed Sadeghi, who migrated here I think 6 or 7 years ago. Before that, he was living in Malaysia and Asia and doing solo performances around there. Before that, living in Iran, where he studied and all that sort of stuff. That's very interesting music in that it's I guess traditional Iranian music or Persian music mixed with jazz.
Mm-hmm.
But when I've been working with Ahmed, I think for about 3 or 4 years now, and it is that on the surface. We've got some Iranian instruments, we've got some Western instruments, and we're using some Western jazz dialogue and also some Iranian sort of sounds and whatnot. But it really is very unique music.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are other artists, I think around Europe especially, that are doing a lot of this sort of cross-cultural music. Whereas when working with Ahmed, he's very much an intuitive composer. So he's sort of writing down what he thinks and telling us what he feels, and we're sort of interpreting it in that thing as opposed to being very literal with concepts, which I'm very, very happy about. With that ensemble, we've been over to Taiwan with it. Ahmed's taken it to a few other different countries. I think we were supposed to go over to Portugal this year, but with this whole virus thing, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But we've been doing some fun gigs with them. I mean, we've done quite a number of shows in Sydney, but I think we were supposed to be going to Melbourne, Hobart, maybe a few other places. Brisbane. We were supposed to be going to Brisbane this year as well. So that's interesting music. That's Hamid Sadeghi on guitar, which is a 3 double-string instrument, a very old instrument, very ancient instrument from Iran, but a very common instrument with traditional music. Pedro Mlahik, who's the guitarist. Michael Janikos, a wonderful Sydney-based jazz sax player. He plays in lots of very good ensembles. And also Adam Yilmaz, who's a percussionist from Turkey, who's based in Sydney. But yeah, that's a really fun ensemble. I mean, there's a few clips of them sort of floating around with that. But whenever we perform with that group, it's always quite an interesting experience. Our last performance, I think, was in the Blue Mountains, and it was during the fires there.
Whoa!
And we were surprised at how many people came. And some of the conversations afterwards were, "Oh, we don't know if we're going to go back to our house tonight, but we're glad we came here." Which was a bit terrifying, but we're very thankful for everyone who came down, which was a bit of fun. The next group I think I sent you was the Ephemera Ensemble.
Yeah, it was with trumpet, and was that viola in that group?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, viola. Yeah. So that's Kolstein. He's from Miami, but he migrated here a few years ago. He's a very, very interesting musician, a very, very experienced classical performer, played with lots of different orchestras, but also an improviser as well. And also that group was put together by Keita Wilkins, who's the flute and piano player. And she's a very, very, very interesting composer in that her concepts and influences come from space. So much so that some of these solo pieces, some of the group pieces that we do, we actually use sounds from space. So microwave signals that have come from black holes or comets or planets or whatnot, being condensed into sound files, and then we sort of play along with it and interpret it. And
that's cool. The video you sent me, it was like a solar flares or something in the background. I think it was something, right? It was really interesting. I love seeing how people creatively combine things, especially something like space. That's such a it's such an epic thing to add into your music. Wow.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting because I've sort of I'll have a look at what sort of updates we have from the science world, and every time there's a new planet discovery or whatnot, I'll sort of think, okay, I'm going to get a new piece sent to me by Keita.
Nice.
Keina's also quite prolific in other areas. She's got an ensemble called Yalugi, which is her with wonderful didgeridoo player Marais Newman. And they recently premiered a new concerto for didgeridoo and orchestra with the Metropolitan Orchestra in Sydney. It's very good to be working with someone who's so prolific but also so creative in that sense in various levels. After that, a group called Masha's Legacy, which is like an Arabic jazz ensemble that's been put together by Stu Vandergraaf, a Sydney-based sax player. Yeah,
you had a groovy bass solo in that. There's a really cool track that you sent me of that one. It's like pretty early on, you took a solo, and there's just like I'm trying to remember the name of the track that you sent me, but it was really very cool. Middle Eastern jazzy kind of mingling.
Yeah, Stu's been involved with Arabic music for who knows how long. He's based in Sydney. He's a studied jazz saxophone player, but has also taken up Arabic and A. Plus, I guess he's been involved with the Arabic community in Sydney for I'm not going to say how long, but probably at least 10 years or so. And he's also spent a lot of time studying Makam and Arabic music. And this album that he put out, I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago. It really is a consistent dialogue within that music. Like there is a lot of quotes with Arabic music, with using quarter tones and Arabic rhythms and whatnot, but also with jazz language as well, which I've found very interesting. And the people in that ensemble are very, very interesting musicians. The oud player is Adnan Baraki, a wonderful Syrian composer performer who studied through the Middle East, but also studied Western classical music in Russia. So he's got an interesting perspective with that sort of dialogue. Plus, also Adam Yilmaz, the specialist from Eishan, is also an from a few other people. Oh. So there's quite a few different things that I'm involved with. I'm sort of very glad that there's these different ensembles that sort of are put together around here. And I think with what I do, I think people sort of call you for a specific reason. Sort of, they want sort of some sort of solo type thing or some sort of thing within that world, which is it's always a bit fun.
There's another piece that I thought was really interesting that you sent me. It was like a string quartet, or really a string quintet, because you were in there in bass clarinet, and it was like two pieces in one, or something like that. It sounded like it was a composed piece at first, and then you went into an improv. There was a large section with you improvising, right? What was that I was listening to? Yeah.
That was a little thing put together by Paul Cutlan, a very, very highly regarded Australian jazz sax player, but also a crossover classical artist. And that was a string quartet. I guess I don't think it's easy to put Paul into a sort of a category, but he is involved in many aspects of Western music. So he's a very, very experienced jazz musician. He's also a very experienced composer. I think he does occasionally do some sort of modern classical performances here and there. But that was a really interesting combination of those two languages. So getting the string quartet involved in a sort of semi-jazz type thing, then also the bass part is essentially a jazz bass part, and Paul with his clarinet and a little saxophone was sort of walked in between a little bit. But that's an interesting.
Well, I'd love to know, like, what you do, because you're working in a lot of different genres right here, and then obviously all this solo bass playing that you do. What does your time on the bass look like? Practice time or time you spend, and you probably have a whole lot more of it at the moment with the quarantine going on. But I'm just curious, like, do you block out a set of time and just improvise or loop on a daily basis, or is that only every once in a while, or do you ever sit down and actually put pen to paper and write things out, or is it all pretty much? I just love to know what your time, maybe not on the stage, your time with the instrumental or working on your musical craft. Like, what does that look like for you?
I put together a method a few years ago while I was I was sort of away from the instrument due to some medical things, and sort of gave me an opportunity to sort of reform how you put things together and sort of what I want out of the instrument, what I want out of music, and that sort of thing. I guess before that, if each different performance is coming up, I'd sort of work towards that. So if I've got a semi-classical performance coming up, I'll work towards that. Jazz performance, work towards that. And slowly but surely, just sort of get everything together. But I did find that sort of lack of consistency with that work can be quite detrimental. So if your brain's constantly looking this way, then constantly looking this way, and looking that way, you do start to lose what are you actually trying to achieve on this instrument. You're just constantly trying to cater for different things. So I sort of broke it down into 6 different parts of sort of what should be, fundamental, and also what you need to be doing when you perform. I think as a real fundamental thing is intonation. Having good intonation for any performer is essential, but also if you're a soloist, it's very, very essential, because you don't want to be a soloist who, intonation in the aspect of not necessarily just simply playing in tune, but playing in tune with whatever's going on. Because you could be a recording situation, or it could be a performance in front of people, and it depends what performance setting you're in. If you're in acoustic performance, that's fantastic, but if you've got microphones all over your instrument, the sound of the instrument's going to be completely different out there, and sort of how do you achieve some sort of consistency with all that? Also working with a loop pedal. If you do a dodgy loop, then that's going to be going on for the next 10 minutes or so. So you want to sort of make sure that's in the bag. So intonation is a very important part of practice. And I think just being very confrontational with it. So just sort of not being happy with things that aren't right. No one's perfect, but sort of really being on top of that is often quite essential for practice. Rhythm is very important as well. The fundamental bass playing rhythm is very, very important. And when you're working with different ensembles, one ensemble might prefer the rhythm being played this way or rhythm being played that way. You need to have a consistent perspective of rhythm. You can't just always be thinking, okay, I'm going to be on top of the beat, okay, I'm always going to be behind the beat. You always need to make sure that you're in time. Then if you need to be left of center, then you can sort of go with it. And also, away from that contemporary context, working with classical musicians and understanding what rhythm is in that context as well, is always something you need to be on top of. Being able to read people and work with the music and being, having an understanding of the music, especially working with Baroque music or classical music or romantic music, just an understanding of the music is always essential. It's not like you can sort of turn up and start it on the gig. And I guess with rhythm as well, if you're looking at cross-cultural music, so looking at Arabic music or Persian music, is you're working with rhythms that the other musicians know really, really well. So if you're playing in a 9/8 or you're playing in a 10/8 or you're playing in a 5/8, you don't want to be the only person who's not familiar with what's going on. It's very essential because it can be very confronting if you're in a group room and you're the only person who doesn't know where the one is. So that's a very, very important part of just the consistent sort of aspect of practice. After that, bowing exercises is a fundamental part of any string instrument I find. You can never be too good with sort of the various languages you have to go with your tone, with consistency with with solo performance, it really is endurance a lot of the time. Just sort of, okay, the first half hour I'm fine sort of getting what I need to be doing, but in the last 2 hours, sort of, am I still sort of on top of things, and how do I manage that? How do I avoid hurting myself? I've got a lot of beginner students at the moment, and just sort of really nailing issues of too much tension and sort of poor bow holds and things like that. Those sorts of issues really start to come to the forefront the longer you play. I think especially, bass players who play operas and whatnot, who are sitting at the bass for sort of 2 or 3 hours a night, they know exactly about all this sort of stuff and how to sort of not do that sort of thing. Same thing, jazz artists who play, pizzicato for 3 hours a night, same sort of thing, sort of maintaining a good technique and not hurting yourself. After that, I always make sure I play a bit of Bach sort of a few times every week because it's always quite tricky. So I think it's the fundamental of most musicians. Always working on a solo piece just to make sure I'm doing something creative in that sense. So it could be a solo classical piece, or it could be a solo jazz piece, or something. Always working on like an improvised piece, and then after that, always working on what repertoire we're coming up. So it's a clean division of 6 different elements that I find are important to what I'm doing, and if I can stick to that, then I should be fine sort of with whatever's going on. You can't always be on top of everything. You can definitely try it.
Yeah, no, it's great. I love hearing people's systems and what they come up with, and I think especially for someone who might do the work you do, which seems to be quite different. You're not just going and playing Beethoven symphonies every day. You're like functioning in very different musical contexts, and so it's cool that you got those like fundamentals that you check in with, on a consistent basis. That's great. Man, I hope we get a chance to hang out in person one of these days. Let me know if your travels once they start up again, bring you this direction over to California or the U.S. and I'll definitely let you know the next time I'm in Australia.
Yeah, no, I think I might be heading over to India maybe next year, which should be a bit of fun. But just sort of seeing how this whole virus thing goes. But hopefully try and get some performances happening over there and see how it goes.
Yeah. The next time when we finally start playing in public again, it's going to be a really nice feeling, I think, for everybody.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Well, I'm sorry it took us so long to reconnect. It's been like several years, I think. And I think I don't even remember when we chatted, maybe 2017 or something like that. So let's do it again and have it not be 3 years from now. So the door is always open. Whatever you got, whatever next new project, and I know there will be one, judging on everything you're up to. Yeah, anything else? I'll send people to your Instagram, to your Facebook page, anywhere else you want people to check out, or I'll link up to everything we were talking about, of course.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, sort of whatever's happening, I mean, in one way or another, people find out about what you're doing. So,
okay.
Yeah, let people know.
Cool. Well, enjoy your Friday. What time is it again right now in Australia?
It's 9:30.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for the early early rising and enjoy the day. I'm going to go relax and have dinner Thursday night here. So, but yeah, it's great. It's great to chat. Great to see you across the world. And yeah, my best to you. And can't wait till you and all of us are out there on the road and playing some live music again.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jason.
Cool.
I hope you stay safe with all this as well.
You too, Elsen. Take it easy. Elsen, great to chat with you. Folks, we got links to everything we were talking about in the show notes, so be sure to visit that and learn about what he's up to. Thank you so much for listening. Maybe you're listening right during this pandemic. Maybe you're going back through the archives. Regardless, thank you for checking out the podcast. I really appreciate it. I know Elsen appreciates it. We've got, 700 episodes besides this one. So if you're new to the show, you can dig back in the archives. If you'd like to connect with us, wherever you hang out online, we're there, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or Instagram. We put out weekly blog posts, and you can find that all linked up at contrabassconversations.com, where you can also join our email newsletter and stay connected with us, with the global bass community and everything that's going on there. So welcome. Thank you. If you've been here for a while, thank you for being here and being with us on this journey. And thank you to the team who put these episodes together. Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchey, Mitch Moehring, Trevor Jones, and Krista Kopper. Mitch makes beautiful basses just outside of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Award-winning basses. Check him out online at mitchmoehring.com. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.